Team, 2 years ago, Donna and I were traveling Italy, and my morning routine was getting up really early and enjoying a couple of Americanos. They were so delicious. And while I was reading, I fell in love with a book at that time 2 years ago called A Minute to Think, Reclaim Creativity, Conquer Busyness, and Do Your Best Work by Juliet Funt. And then I chased Juliet for 2 years to get her on the Selling Well podcast. That's how much I love the book. Long sell cycle, but I was successful. In today's podcast, we're talking to Juliet about this book, and it's really such an important topic. It's about the topic of how we've kind of created this culture of insatiability and busyness, and how none of us professionally allow any white space in our calendars. We think we've just got to stay busy, 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 instead of taking a pause and get productive. And so many of the things in Juliet's book really resonated with me. But one analogy that we discussed in the podcast today was just that of building a fire. If you're an outdoor person and you've built fires and you understand this, you don't take the kindling and the fuel and the wood and just jam it all together super tightly and try and light a fire. It won't work. You actually need space in between the elements to give it the oxygen, some opportunity, and the fire some opportunity to breathe, to build. And that's really the analogy that explains this concept so well. And many of you know I'm a member of Strategic Coach, and they're very big on free days in a given week where you take full days off. This discussion's about our work week when we are actually working. How do we build in some time for using some of the chapters from a book, to put a wedge, in between meetings to give us a chance to breathe, take a strategic pause. We're going to start to see the value and impact of that. And we start to think about what are the thieves of time within our professional life that actually stop us from doing good work. So it's the same assets that we have professionally: drive, excellence, information, activity. Those are things that make us great at our job. Those are things we do in our job, but there's always a downside to them. If you're driven, then you may be, burning yourself out. If you focus on excellence, you might actually be a perfectionist. So you've got these assets that end up becoming potential thieves of time, and we talk about remedies for these things. The book is super interesting, by the way. Juliet actually had a conversation with one of my heroes, John Cleese from Monty Python. And even John Cleese talked about how when he was trying to be super creative in the day with the comedy, how it was so important to think of something and then park it somewhere and come back to it. So give yourself a little time to think about it, let it soak in, and park it, and then giving yourself a little bit of that space enabled you to be better and come up with better ideas. It's such an interesting conversation. We also get into, some of the things we all deal with: social media, email. How are these things kind of taking away from any free time or white space or the ability for a strategic pause? And what do we do about them? Very practical book, extremely interesting read, by the way. I really enjoyed my conversation here today with Juliet. I think you will too. And if you do, by the way, please like and subscribe to the Selling Well podcast, because of course it really matters to us. That's actually how we attract great guests to share with you. Folks, I hope you enjoy this. Here's Juliet Funt. Juliet, welcome to the show. It's so great to meet you.
I'm so happy to be here.
A couple of thoughts. The book resonated with me so much, Juliet. And today, folks, of course, we're talking about A Minute to Think, Reclaim Creativity, Conquer Your Busyness, and Do Your Best Work. Because for a very good portion of my life, I would have been one of those people maybe defined as a workaholic and always working and pushing and feeling that busyness or sense of urgency that we create. And your book resonated with me when I was on a trip to Rome with my wife, and I get up crazy early in the morning. So I was actually reading the book in the morning. And when you're talking about, I think it's Matronk, Italy, a town of 25.
Matrone, yes.
Matrone, thank you.
Yes.
Matrone, Italy, where you were talking in the book about this town of 25 people up this crazy, steep mountain.
Yes.
And the main person sort of helping you at this town of 25 people, you and your family, is talking about how busy they are. And you start to think, how busy can you be in a town of 25 people? I thought, boy,
I think it was 21. And then when we got there, it was 26.
Oh my goodness.
It was
crazy.
Tiny, yes. And the gentleman was a a farmer. They made their homemade pestos. They raised geese in the kitchen, but he had the same insane metronome inside of him that you would have if you were watching someone rush down Market Street in San Francisco on the way to a job at Salesforce. It's just so funny how it can be everywhere.
Yeah, it's so pervasive. And by the way, when I was reading it, even though I was on vacation, I was just loving it so much. But of course, I'm not the only one. Folks, when you pick up this book and read it, which you will, and of course, the link is in the show notes. Folks like Seth Godin and Pat Lencioni provided wonderful testimonials on the back of the book. One of our favorites, Daniel Pink, did the same thing. He's been on the Selling Well podcast. We love Daniel. But the idea of this topic being so important, so finding this opportunity to get away from the busyness, get away from quantity of work, move to quality of work.
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit about your professional journey and what kind of led you to this specific topic.
Well, they always say that you're solving your own problem. So you and I could probably go to the same Workaholics Anonymous meeting if we wanted to go together. And I would probably then leave you, have a coffee, and go to the Technology Anonymous meeting where I would talk about how addicted I am to my laptop and my phones. And so when you start from this hard wiring of always wanting to move and go and be connected and get the next thing, I think you spend your entire, I did spend my entire professional career really seeking solutions to my own problems that then became very flexible to solutions to share with other people.
Yeah,
I sometimes feel if I don't have my own book in my purse that I would just disappear in a wave of busyness because it's a chronic condition that needs a repetitive and almost meditative return again and again and again to remembering the benefits of slowing down, doing less, having it all be enough, which is so difficult when, they say success is a mountain that gets higher as you climb it. And I
that's
love that
right.
one for me. And so I always have having to take my own medicine. My journey was interesting. I started in professional speaking 25 years ago in youth and education. And my
Mm,
first forum was colleges, high schools, and I talked to children and teenagers who were too busy. They became stressed, and the program was called Overcommitted, Overwhelmed, and Over It. And as I sat in these mixed audiences talking about collegiate overwhelm and teenage overwhelm and the stress of busyness, the parents would be sitting in saying, "Excuse me, I work in a firm that has the same problem." And so I would be helping these college students and high school students with their collegiate stress and high school stress. And meanwhile, there were parents in the audience that were thinking, "Well, I have a firm and we have the same problems," which was the transition for me from youth and education to corporate and association, and then led into a 20-year career helping people solve their busyness and figure out not only to find time to think, which is very important in the title of the book, but also to curb the volume and quantity of all of the rest of the workday. So a lot of our work in teams when we're in companies is really tactical efficiency work. I think I started to tell you about some of the things we're doing with the Air Force and the military and special
yes.
operations because everyone in the world has too much to do in too little time, and they all have more tasks in the day than they can manage.
Well, you touched on a couple things that are so interesting there, but this thing about the corporate world. So today I'm an entrepreneur and I've been one for 10 years. But
Mhm.
I grew up in the corporate world running large sales organizations and massive companies. And this sort of culture of busyness, and we'll talk about this, the use of email, which was ridiculous in the CC. And the further up the chain you went, email became the unhappiest place in the world for you to spend your time.
Yeah, that's
Because
right.
it's overwhelming all the time. The average executive getting 275 a day and all of this kind of thing. I think one of the things that I found so interesting at the beginning when we talk about this challenge that I experienced in the corporate world, I certainly wasn't alone. And so in the book you call out a couple of key corporate stats. Gallup tells us 23% of workers feels burnout more often than not. Deloitte found that two-thirds of today's employees feel overwhelmed. And an astounding 80% of men would like to work fewer hours.
Hmm.
And so,
And those
this
were 4 years ago. So it's
think of
definitely
now.
worse. Yeah, definitely
Yeah,
worse.
it's definitely worse now. And when I think of some of the environments I was in, there was this real culture of it was almost, the more you work, the less you sleep, the more coffee you're drinking. It was kind of this badge of honor.
Yes.
And the reality, frankly, as an entrepreneur and the coaching programs I'm involved in as an entrepreneur, it's actually the opposite. The most successful entrepreneurs know they have to take days off and they want to work less and they want a self-managing company so they're not doing everything. But it's completely reversed in this corporate world. Is the problem getting better or worse in your view?
Well, we had a few gains from COVID. We had that little bit of extra balance that I think will retain itself in hybrid work. But I'm gonna give you my honest answer, and I'll preface it by saying I'm very concerned right now that I sound negative about our horizon ahead. And so I'm trying so hard to be mindful of the choice and perspective, but I do feel very worried for people right now. I feel like something has happened in the last 4 years where executives and executive teams have seemingly demonstrated less and less care, especially in larger companies, huge companies, and that care demonstrated by the resources that they spend on people. Now, I
Mm,
understand why they're doing it. I think that they're very afraid of competition in the economy and AI, and so they're distracted and they think that resources should go elsewhere. But it's been years since people were the focus. And I don't even understand what they think happened to all the latent burnout from COVID that was in everybody's bodies and systems. And then somehow we just magically moved into hybrid and then into normalcy. And I don't think it left people. I think that it's living inside of us as this latent anxiety and stress all the time. And so I'm pretty worried about what's going on out there. And I think that the solutions that are being deployed are very, very downstream in their nature, therapists and wellness days. And
mm.
that's way at the end of the cycle, as opposed to going up to these predictable, unbelievably obvious patterns of 11 hours of back-to-back Zoom meetings and vacations where you check email every morning before the kids wake up. And this incredibly predictable life circumstances that are leading to chronic burnout, but not really being addressed at that upstream point. So I am ever a hopeful person, but it's a tough time. I think it's a tough time to make room for people.
Well, I think it's a tough time to be courageous. And what
Mm,
I always find with these things is you have to be, particularly in the corporate world, I think you have to be in an environment where you're comfortable enough as a senior executive where you can veer away from the norm for your team and
hmm.
step away. Because I think that the corporate mass in general, it's not a smart animal. And
Not in the big companies, yeah. I mean, that's
they're
why we're for the very first time in our careers moving toward mid-sized companies, because there still is a little bit more humanity and control retained. And I'm finding like the heart of the owner is still palpable in the environment. And so that's been a really big change for us trying to meet these mid-sized and smaller business leaders.
And you reference a couple of these great ones, like the CEO of Basecamp.
Yes.
We're big fans of Basecamp, but these folks who are doing smart things that say, listen, it's not optional. You've got to take your vacation. You've got to take your lunch. And by the way, if you don't, we're going to penalize you. I think some of these things are so smart by standing behind the walk. Sometimes it does feel, without being cynical, it feels at the corporate level, they do some things really to insulate themselves from liability, to say we have these programs available, or you could have done this, or we have an HR department. But at the core, you don't get that feeling that we're actually trying to help folks. But
Right.
this podcast is trying to help folks. And by the way, you've spoken to a couple of people. You're a little famous in my eyes, for a couple of reasons. First of all, not just because you speak on some of the largest stages in the world. One of the comedy gods in my eyes is John Cleese.
Yes, he
And
was great.
oh my goodness. And if those folks out there who are fans of great comedy, smart comedy, Monty Python, life changing. Some of the funniest things ever invented have come from Monty Python. But tell our folks, the circumstances by which you end up interviewing John Cleese and talking about him sharing the importance of white space.
I did. And he, first of all, comes on the line. I don't know if he's 80, 85. I have no idea how old he's flirting from the first second
Oh,
he's on the line.
fantastic.
He's laughing. He's making me laugh. He's just incredible. And I'm a huge fan. But he wrote about white space for years. And that's why I wanted to interview him. In his book, I'm going to miss the name of one of the books he wrote in the past, but he wrote about what he called open mode and closed mode. And he would talk to corporations, not a lot, but from time to time, about when they were in the Python-esque creative frame, how they had to be in this open mode of just receptivity and lots of space and 90-minute chunks of unplanned time, as opposed to the closed mode, as he called it, of doing and making work go forward. In fact, one of his techniques has become one of my creative favorites, called a set aside technique. He said that when he was working with the other Pythons, he found that he was talking about one in particular whose name I won't say, but he said when he compared the two of them, he always found honestly like his inventions were a little bit more novel. And the reason that he attributed that was that when the other Python would get an idea, if it was a good solid idea, they would go for it and use it. And Cleese would not. He would get a good idea, he would note it, set it aside, and then return to the well. And he would ponder again, and then he would get another good idea and set it aside. I do this all the time creatively when I think I've latched quickly onto the next fabulous idea. I'll use his technique to pause and say, nice, let me write that down, and then go all the way back to a white board and see what comes next. And he said that in that iterative process, he would get deeper and better ideas over time, which I completely agree with.
And was that the yellow list? When you say to putting it away and coming back to it, is that the yellow list that you speak to?
You could. I'll teach you the yellow list because it's the number one tool to reduce email traffic, but it's not, that is a form of a yellow list, but it's a little bit more strict in its usual definition. The yellow list is just a document that you keep in your computer for each person or team that you work with frequently. And when you're about to send a digital communication, sometimes
Mm,
literally when you're about to type, you pause and say, wait a minute, should this actually be digital, or could I just jot this down on the yellow list for the next time I talk to this person? When we get senior executives, we make them take out their email, we make them do yellow list inventories, and they go through and try to allocate what percentage of the email traffic that they are generating, if they had this mindful tool, could actually have been saved for a yellow list. It's often 20, 30, 50% of email traffic. Now, what that leads to then is that when you send an email, the thing about email is that every email has babies, and then those emails have babies,
love
and
that.
those emails have babies. So if you cut
Yeah.
it off at the source and you can stop before the first send, you compartmentalize, you bring things into an interpersonal realm, because that conversation, when you finally debrief the yellow list, is going to be face to face or ear to ear, has just so many incredible benefits. You talked about the perils of email, so I'll throw in one of the other tactical favorites for everyone, which is to, in addition to the yellow list, now you're curbing your outbound. That's going to curb your inbound. Now, create a CC FYI folder and train your Outlook or your Mac so that every email that comes in that is either CC or FYI goes into one folder, and you only check that folder once a day.
Right.
So now you've reduced the volume, and now you've really cut off the stream in those two simple actions.
While we're tactically on email, which is this stuff is just such gold. A couple of things I always share, particularly with folks in professional sales out there. Email makes me sad generally. So I know you talk about the
Yes.
dopamine hit and people we can't wait to see, but having been a senior executive in a large corporation for so long, and even sometimes with our smaller team here in the funnel, it's rare that I'm going to get a dynamite piece of news via email, and it feels like it's work, and the work is getting through them because there's
Mhm.
this thing in you that says, "Hey, I got to get through them," and we file things away and all the rest of it, but there's absolutely nothing worse than opening your phone and seeing an email from somebody that's 4 paragraphs long and has a diagram, and it feels, there's this ongoing coaching that I feel like I'm giving folks, saying you have to actually work very hard to write me the short letter. Mark Twain was
Yes.
right.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we say clarity, brevity, and punch are the three components of a perfect email. So, clarity, are you thinking stream of consciousness, or did you actually put some intention into the thing that you wrote? Brevity, are you writing, we say, like a bikini, brief but covering the main subject matter? So,
Fantastic.
how can you get it tight, 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 tight? And then punch is a visual element where we're separating out certain pieces of text with bolding and underlining and bullets so that the eye doesn't have to be looking at this mass of, oh, I have to read this novel on my way down it. It's a little bit lighter. So it's a great thing to, we can, we drill with teams and workshops, writing with clarity, writing with brevity, writing with punch. Nobody teaches people how to write. And we find this in corporate, and we find this in the military. When we hire anybody, the first thing that we do is get a video of them speaking and a writing sample because we want to see if they can present themselves and we want to see how they write. But it's a fading talent for sure. And I would say that brevity of all of them is probably the one that is the hardest for people.
Sometimes I might be starting to sweat here a little bit. I've reported to some tough people throughout the course of my career. So, think of the extremely nasty hockey coaches that somewhere in their psyche, they thought they were helping you, but
Yes,
they weren't.
right.
But one of them did teach a very good lesson because just had absolutely no patience for anything. And so when you communicated in any way or set an agenda for a meeting, almost anything you said, he was a bit of a turnaround person. You were watching the words that you shared. Like it was you
Mm,
were literally getting one or two sentences, but it did teach you to send that, kind of 3 sentence email that set up the meeting perfectly. The objective was very clear. These are the things we're asking for an answer on. And to his credit, what he did do is when you did that, he read it. So if you
mm.
did it properly, come into the meeting, still wasn't an easy meeting, but he would still, he would actually read what you sent. So this concept, as all of us in professional sales, think of what we're doing to our buyers when, many of us
Oh,
still can't write. We're sending emails and
whelming.
proposals and presentations, agonizingly boring, super detailed. And then we wonder why they don't understand our competitive differentiation in the marketplace because they couldn't extract it from the 400-word email.
Well, there's a million things to talk about there. So, first of all, I write proposals too for our training and consulting company. And we all know that everyone just skips to the last page just to see what the price is. So, everything that is before that is skimmed over the first time anyway. And then they'll go back and they'll read, but they've already made a value decision probably based on the last page. And so now you have to resell them almost in terms of your value. I love when people are willing to be coached to come down off of what Donald Miller calls the bowling balls that we hand people in communication, just such weighty, overwritten text. And the way that we get them to do it is with a tool called the mental highlighter. And we
Mm,
get people to have printouts of verbose emails. And we first have them highlight with a yellow highlighter what's actually of highest value on the page. And when they've done that, we say, what if that tool was in your mind? What if you could just look at something and just mentally highlight? Then you could start asking yourself, well, why are the rest of the words there? And how many of these words can you reduce? And you see emails begin to drop from 200 words to 100 words to 30 words. Sometimes they disappear entirely and it's just a short yellow list mention at the end of that exploration. But thinking as if you have a highlighter is a great way. And this works for proposals or slides, anything where you can identify high value words and then pause to step back and say, now, why are the other words still there? And it will give you the
yes.
same objectivity.
Well, outside of being so frustrated when you read it, the forgetting curve with Herman Ebbinghaus is still alive and well. In
Right.
1885, it creates a formula for how quickly people forget learned information. And the only reason we still know Herman's name is turns out he was right. And the
Hmm.
formula keeps getting tested. And when we run our training workshops, we realize that 2 hours after a workshop, half the people will forget half of the things you talked about unless you interrupt it somehow, that
Hmm.
forgetting curve. So really critically important for all of us out there in terms of communication. But let's circle back to the top end. We got really tactical, super helpful with email, but let's start at the beginning. When we start to think of this whole concept of, we need this moment to pause, we need the white space. What really resonated with me, Juliet, was the analogy of the fire because I'm like you, I've never camped before. So, if I was left out there, I'd have a hard time starting a fire. But you use a great example with you and your 3 boys and your husband out in the woods trying to make that first fire up in the cabin. You had all the materials, but they were so condensedly packed together. There was no oxygen
That's
to let the
right.
fire breathe. So
That's
nothing
right.
happened.
And we, as a novice fire maker, I did sort of pack it in there the first time. The beautiful thing about this oxygenation metaphor is as soon as you refluff the stack and open up the space between the wood, the first match just takes everything away. And that's all it needs, really. And what's so completely reliable is that human beings are the same. and work teams are the same and that great ideas are the same. Everyone wakes up in the morning with a little spark that will be their professional contribution, and they walk in hoping for it to be fanned and oxygenated. And sadly, as we were talking about
Right.
before, usually it's the opposite that happens, that by about 9:45, things seem overwhelming and hopeless and stressful, and that little spark is quickly extinguished. So space, we should probably define white space. We call it time without assignment.
Mm,
And the reason that it's white is because all in the back, I'm trying to see if I have a paper calendar with me. In the old days of coaching executives, way back in the day, I would get some busy, crazed executive and I would try to get him to just open up the paper planner and say, show me the white spaces on there. Where is the time that you don't know where you're already going to be? Because that is where possibility is held in your day. And so those white spaces, quite literally, became this idea of time without assignment. And we advocate that people take it in really manageable sips. We can't all take an executive stretch of 30 minutes, but you can take a minute and you can take 2 minutes. You can insert what we call a little wedge of
a
white
wedge.
space in between activities, and you open and oxygenate. And now you have 7 minutes between your meetings, and now you have 2 minutes to transition projects. And you pull in the driveway at home and you take 3 minutes before you come into kids so you can be present. And all of a sudden there's oxygen in the system.
So critically important. Again, you go back to the pandemic days. Those were some of the first things we picked up when we were on Zoom calls for 8 hours straight, how mentally exhausted we were.
Oh,
I remember physically putting in 14, 15, 16-hour days, no trouble at all, then working out at the end of a day. But suddenly when I was sitting at a desk and it was all through Zoom, the exhaustion at the end of the day, the mental fatigue was unlike anything I'd come across. And the second thing I always like to contemplate, whether we're an executive running large teams or we're actually selling and we're interacting with, clients and buyers, we owe it to them to be our best self to the people in the meeting. We owe it to them.
yes.
So taking that pause and reflection, little bit of meditation, whether it's box breathing or something that gets you out of that last meeting, allows you to leave that stuff, and then come in to be your authentic self in this meeting. It's so critically important. But boy, I'd say that the wedge is not something that's universally leveraged in the business community these days. That's for sure.
Not yet. Not yet. It's
Not
not.
yet.
But I will say this is you talked about sort of the well-being resilience angle of that pause. And I will tell you that there's another one that's paramount for sellers. And it's difficult to sell to them because of the ego around. I can get into my Herman Miller at 159 and spin around and I'm on and I'm good and I know my stuff. And we chronically undervalue the strategic white space before sales meetings to
Oh,
deeply get to know the person you're about to talk to what I call take a bath in the client. I will spend
nice.
10 or 15 minutes just, I'm on YouTube. Is there a video of them talking? I'll read their website. I'll look at their LinkedIn. I want to be in their universe deeply. Do I have notes from the last time that we talked before I get on the phone with them? And if you don't have wedges, you are pretending to be present for the first 5 minutes of every meeting while you secretly move the notes from the last meeting over to, and then you get your post-its organized, and you're not as good an actor as you think you are. So you're not as present. And at some point, about 5 or 6 minutes later, you will click in and they may or may not feel it. And it's just a pernicious detractor of your connection with other people. So from a sales perspective, that's where we really double down on white space for teams, that every seller should be trained in this protocol.
Bravo. Whether it's there's a number of folks who've talked about, how quickly you can sense somebody else's intent. And
Yes,
and
yes, yes.
so, if you walk into that meeting and I love that, bathe yourself in the customer. I've seen them on YouTube. I understand what's going on with their business. Maybe I've leveraged a little bit of AI to help me. I know
Yes,
them, their
smart.
business. I know I've got this point of interest as to why we're having this conversation. I think psychologically, I feel like I've earned the right for an
Hmm.
authentic conversation, and I think it comes across.
I think
And
you're right. And I love that. I also, there's the text-based preparation, AI reading, et cetera. And then there's something for me, you can't always get it about the human part, if you can listen to them talk or on a
Oh,
podcast or on a video and you're it's not going to be the very first time that you hear their voice, it's just an
yes.
incredibly powerful way of orienting yourself to another person.
I absolutely, the other thing we always throw out, I like looking at somebody's picture. So
Hmm.
particularly if I'm selling and I'm doing demand generation, if I'm writing an email to them, I might be looking at your picture of you on in your book. So it feels somehow like I'm making a connection. I see your smiling face and I feel a little bit more connected. And I think those things tend to come across. Just wonderful. By the way, you see how important all of these things in terms of taking the rest, the break, all of these things are universal for executives or salespeople. Let's get into, some of the thieves of time. So when we've got these folks out here listening today, we're at work, we're doing the things that we want to do, but there are thieves of the of time, and there's remedies for these thieves of time that we can talk
Yes.
about. So a lot of folks, you talked about A personalities at the start of this. We know there's a lot of driven entrepreneurs out there listening to this today. There's a lot of driven salespeople. What's the real risk when somebody's too driven?
Well, let's put that in the context of the thieves themselves. So, the thieves came out of our research studying busy people, and we found that there were actually four main drivers that fueled almost all professional overload. And what was tricky was that they were all good things that had simply
Right.
overgrown. There wasn't a bad thing in the list. And they were four things: they were drive, excellence, information, and activity. And if you do a developmental assessment, we have one that's like a Myers-Briggs or a disc on the thieves. You'll see that different people lean toward different ones. So I would assume from your audience, you're going to have a lot of high drive people, but drive as an asset has a corresponding risk, which is in the age of overload, it becomes overdrive. And so when
Yes.
we're doing 9 projects in the same month for our poor, exhausted team, we are no longer running at an optimal battle rhythm for them. And each of the thieves has a corresponding risk. I am a high excellence person, so mine is perfectionism. Information turns into information overload, and activity can become just frenzy. And so, what happens with the thieves is they love little victories and stimulation. They keep going for that dopamine hit, that thin achievement in the day. And they keep us from the kind of mode where we can go deep into that really quiet work. That work, for me, my deep mode time is about 7 a.m. before anyone's awake, and I can go deeply into it. Once you get into that cadence with the thieves during the day, for me, it all becomes about tiny boxes being checked. And this is where you can end up at the end of a day or a week or a month or a year feeling like you didn't really move a needle.
Yes. And it's so unsatisfying. Those days are so particularly unsatisfying. The reference you used in the book, which resonated so much with me, it was scary Sunday mornings. The,
Yes.
the best work I've ever done Sunday mornings. And so you ask yourself, I wonder why I'm working so well then. First of all, no crazy sense of urgency,
Yep.
no thieves.
Right.
I'm calm. And by the way, if I want to take a break for 20 minutes and go lie on the couch or play with my cat or do anything, I can go do so guilt free.
Right.
And so is
You're
it particular?
riding the natural pace of your body too on a day like that. You're in the flow of what's natural and normal. You don't have other people bothering you. You don't have Zoom calls. You don't have meetings. I think that that Sunday feeling is possible in the workday if we create containers for it. So, as an example, everyone on my team has a deep work day once a week. And that's just a day where we don't interact with them.
Wow.
So that's their Sunday. And unless, today, Jamie, my assistant, today was her deep work day. We had one emergency for a client. I made one phone call. She got pulled out for 2 minutes, and that happens sometimes. But for the rest of the 8 hours that she will work today, she will be alone and she will not hear from anybody, which is all we really need to replicate that Sunday experience.
What a great, we're going to take that one and apply it to In the Funnel. I've read the
Good,
book, but
good.
I certainly haven't done that. And sometimes um, it's a little more ad hoc where I'm thinking, hey, somebody's working on something. I'm going to try and leave them alone because a lot of the kerfuffle is actually caused by me because
Yeah, join the club, boss.
yeah, we're a small company. So a lot of the issues, I'm the stopgap for many things. I'm the logjam, but I also cause many of the issues. And so instead of intentionally saying, okay, I've got to be careful, Sandra's super busy today, just say 1 day a week, we have no meetings. Nobody has to do anything except the quiet time. They have their own quiet time to go and get the things done that they need done. Although I don't have the data point in front of me, Juliet, I bet you do. One of the things as we wind down a little bit here is, how does this interrelate or relate directly to somebody's happiness in life? So I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a part of a great entrepreneurial coaching program called Strategic Coach. They're huge on successful entrepreneurs taking what's called free days. So
Hmm.
taking a full 24 hours, you don't even read a business book, nothing to do with business, try not to think about it. And they have this theme that says, the more time off you take, the smarter you actually get. And it's amazing how when you're away from the whole game, how everything becomes crystal clear and you become better at what you do. Where does this play, particularly in your world, in this time world that we're talking about? Does it play into somebody's happiness or reducing depression or anxiety? It feels to me like there's a real connection here.
Yes, I'm curious about that practice. Is it an additional day besides a weekend, or is it an instruction simply to take at least one of those weekend days disconnected?
It's the latter, because you're an entrepreneur as well. So you understand that to a certain ceiling of complexity, until you have a self-managing company, entrepreneurs work weekends.
Yes.
And so they just generally, there's the Sunday that comes in for me. But so this idea is, hey, you take at least a full 24 hours off every 7 days. But
Yes.
literally, the more successful you do, a bragging right is how many more days you take. And
Absolutely.
and
And
that
I'm a
includes a
huge
weekend.
believer. I'm a huge believer. I will tell you that some of the greatest demonstrations of white space power in my own work have been the 3 times now that I've taken a 1 month off sabbatical.
Wow. Wow.
And my little team is probably around the same size as yours. And they manage without me so beautifully and so predictably. I've done this a couple of times. And it's incredible the happiness that I regain from being gone that long. And so if you start with that as kind of a grand aspiration, then you move downward from there. I think that when you have time to step out, you are experiencing the only time that you have to look back at your business and become
Mm,
objective about it. So I'll give you an example. I told you this Air Force new thing with the Air Force has been fabulous. And it's honestly been overwhelming in how quickly it is building and pulling me into its constant work. But just yesterday, I had to take some time to pause and say, do I want to build a big military training business? And if I don't, what am I doing? Am I
yes.
just
Yes.
following this complementary inertia of, if in 5 years I had a large military training business, would I want that? Would I want to
Exactly.
run it?
Right.
And if you don't step out of those things, your happiness is always at risk because you're not planning your life intentionally. And there's no way of actually being the coach to your own player as you
Yes.
move forward in your life. So whether it's the willingness to take a 15-minute walk without your phone, or whether it's a full day on the weekend or a 1 month sabbatical, I think these are the moments where you check in with how your life is actually going and you course correct constantly every second, every minute, because it's never going exactly the way that you want it. Oliver Berkman has a wonderful quote. He says, "We spend so much time clearing the decks for the real life to begin." And that I experience that so much. I'll be, even on a weekend, planning this and planning that and cleaning this and cooking that. And you think, am I prepping for something for which this feels like a dress rehearsal? Because it is not. And so I do think it's inextricably linked. I will tell you that the one you asked me for a statistic, balanced people are 21% more effective than people who don't report themselves as being balanced. So when you do return to work after all of this leisure that we're discussing, you show up differently and measurably so.
Well, thank you for that. And by the way, I think it's so important for the folks who listen to this podcast, because many are in sales, many are CEOs of small and medium businesses, but all of them are going to be leading at some point in time. If you've got the growth
Right.
orientation to wanting to be running, listening to this kind of podcast, they're going to be leading. And one of the things that always helped me reconcile taking free days, not filling my calendar when I was a leader, a sales leader, was I felt like I had to be in my best self to be able to coach people effectively, because they're
Mhm.
looking for that calm, confident guidance. And when I first became a leader, 175 years ago, I remember it was a wake up call where I was having a tough time running a sales organization. I was brand new to it. Didn't really understand success through people. The success was still kind of about me. But I remember being in a one-on-one, and I think I said something like, and one day you might be able to have my job. And somebody on the other side of the desk said, I absolutely would never want it. Like saying, you're making this look so unpleasant that
Yeah,
there's no chance. And what a wake up call to go, hey, I'm probably doing this wrong.
that's a hilarious story. Yeah, it's that thing we said earlier, I think we can come back to as we start to slowly wind down is success is a mountain that gets higher as you climb it, which means that you're always exerting more and more and more effort to be what you perceive to be at the same place. And just questioning what you really want and what your real value is, those are only questions that can occur in some white space. There is no way to be doing while pondering your life,
Mm.
one or the other.
Yeah, so well said. So Juliet, super pleasure chatting with you here
You
today.
too.
But folks, we've been talking today about a minute to think, reclaim creativity, conquer busyness, and do your best work. Juliet Funt, whose famous dad, I still remember, of course, Candid Camera. So,
Yes.
so Alan Funt and Candid Camera, great family connection. I love that in the book. Team, this is one of those books. As I mentioned, I was reading it on vacation. Not only are there nuggets of gold in here, but it's actually super well written and crazy interesting. So
Thank
you'll
you.
actually enjoy the book while you're reading it and extracting meaningful things you can take away. But Juliet, I know you do some other amazing things with your training company, including virtual training on all of us doing this better, Zoom calls.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about how someone listening to this podcast can learn more about you, your business, and stay connected to some of the great value you're putting out there in the universe.
Oh, well, thank you for asking. So we are at julietfunt.com, pretty easy, Juliet, F like Fred, UNT.com, and everything that you'd need to reach out to us is there. If you're a military friend listening, it's theefficientteam.com.
Awesome. Team, all of those links will be in the show notes for today. We'd like to really thank Juliet Funt for joining us today. Hopefully, this won't be the
Thank
last
you.
time we chat with Juliet. And team, I'd like to thank you for joining. As all of you know, we run this podcast to improve the performance and professionalism of B2B sales teams because we believe that in doing so, we actually improve the lives of anybody in professional sales. No question in my mind, this podcast today and Juliet's book can help you with that. But we also know we're growth oriented and want to get better. And your feedback is super, super helpful. So if there's another way that we can make this podcast more valuable to you, please let us know. My email is markcox@inthefunnel.com. That's my personal email. And we love constructive criticism. And some of the things we do in the podcast and some of the guests we've chosen are a result of you giving us good advice, and we respond to every email. So thanks for doing that. Please continue to like and subscribe to the Selling Well podcast because that's how we actually get great guests like Juliet. And we'll see everybody next time on the Selling Well.